Good afternoon. Welcome back to this scientific deliberations after a sumptuous lunch. We're going to have a mouth-watering prospect of fantastic scientific presentations on this session titled Agency, Information and Brain-Computer Interface, and we have with us speakers who are internationally renowned experts in neuroscience research ranging from various fields like animal experimentation, computational neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and mathematical modeling. Just to introduce myself in one sentence, because many of you may not be familiar with me, my name is John P. John. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and a professor of psychiatry at the neighboring National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, Bangalore. Apart from my clinical work, I do some research on multimodal neuroimaging in the fields of schizophrenia, dementia, and meditative states. Without much further ado, we have Professor Rajesh P.N. Rao. He is the director of the Center for Sensory Motor Neural Engineering and professor at the University of Washington, Seattle. He received his PhD from the University of Rochester and was an Alfred P. Sloan postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. He has won many international awards, and he is the author of a textbook, Brain-Computer Interfacing. His research spans the areas of computational neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and brain-computer interfacing. He also works on the 4,000-year-old Indus Script, on which he has given a TED Talk, and studies classical Indian painting. Over to you, Professor Rao.
Thank you very much, John, and I'd like to thank the organizers also for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here, especially this kind of conference where it's very stimulating, I think, to hear all the different perspectives from different fields, and especially to see all the young faces here. All the students really enjoy interacting with the students. I'm actually from Karnataka. My hometown is in Udupi, so I'm really happy here. I can talk to you in Kannada if any of you want to talk to me about that, but this talk will be in English, so sorry about that. So what I'll talk about today is, it's almost like a left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing. So I'm going to talk first about some of the work I did early on in computational modeling of the brain, trying to understand perception, cognition, and perhaps some people even say some of these theories could lead to understanding of consciousness. So we'll see if we can debate about that. And the second part will be on brain-computer interfaces. And I'll try to finish on time. I know we all look forward to our coffee and tea. So here's the motivation for the first part, which is, as Mike really beautifully illustrated, our universe, right, is, sorry to disappoint the physicists, our universe is actually in here. It's a 3-pound universe that we have inside our skulls, right? So what exactly defines that universe? At least there's one structure called the cerebral cortex that actually is attributed with a lot of properties that underlie what we might call cognition, and so that's the cerebral cortex that's shown over here. And it is diverse in function in the sense that if you look at different locations, you'll find that there are cells that respond to different properties, with different properties to different kinds of stimuli, or responsible for moving different parts of your body. And at the same time, if you anatomically look at a piece of cortical tissue, so if you cut a piece of, a cubical piece of cortical tissue, you might be hard pressed to really figure out, is that a visual cortex? Is it somatosensory? I mean, there might be some difference in number of, in terms of the amount of cells in a particular layer and so on. But usually, what you'll see there is a 6-layered structure, as shown over here, comprised of cells. Some of the most prominent cells, as Mayank mentioned, are these pyramidal cells. And this relatively uniform structure has tempted a lot of people to come to this hypothesis that perhaps there's a unifying computational principle at work. And there's some intriguing neuroscientific evidence also coming from some work that was done by Mriganka showing that if you take information from the optic nerve, send that to the auditory cortex, it starts responding to visual information. So again, intriguing that there might be perhaps something computationally uniform across different parts of the cortex. Is that really true? And this goes back to 1970s and all the way to now. So there's some clues from the anatomy. Once again, the 6-layered structure shown schematically here. And people have tried to understand it in terms of feed-forward connections and feedback connections. And this comes about from the fact that if you look at the visual cortex, for example, you'll see that there are areas of the visual cortex that seem to be encoding for progressively more complex or more abstract kinds of information. So going at the very lowest level, what's labeled as V1 over here on the left, you start to see cells that respond to bars of light and so on. As you go higher up, you might start to see cells that respond all the way up to faces, for example, or objects and so on. And if you look at how you might impose a hierarchy on the cortex, what you'll see is that there's some structure there in terms of how the connections are coming from the senses. So for example, there tends to be information coming in from the lower areas that target the middle part of the cortical circuit, and then there's information going to the so-called higher areas that tend to originate from the superficial layers, or layers 2 and 3 as shown down there. And similarly, there tends to be feedback going back to the lower area that centered the information, the input information, and that tends to come from the deeper layers of the cortical tissue. And this sort of a structure seems to be the same, this kind of a pattern of input-output connection seems to be the same across different areas of cortex. Once again, very intriguing that there is this anatomical uniformity across multiple cortical areas. And then here's the picture that Mayank also showed. I thought I'll also show you the experiment done by Huber and Wiesel. So what they did was, this was a very classical experiment for which they got the Nobel Prize, basically recording from the cat's visual cortex and showing the cat different kinds of stimuli such as spots or bars or edges and so on. And what they recorded were these kinds of, so here's the stimulus, no response here. When they tilted the bar of light, you hear a response, right? So this indicates there's a selectivity for a diagonally oriented bar that is moving in the retina of this anesthetized cat. And those triangles and those little symbols are basically, in the pre-digital age, they were using actual markers to mark which location in the screen or in this stimulus screen the animal is responding to. So no response for flashes of light. But if you now move the edge, you get a response. So it's responsive to edges and bars in a particular orientation. And so here's what we can illustrate that by, a really simple cartoon saying that there's some spot in the visual world. For each neuron, there might be a particular part it likes called the receptive field. And when you flash a bar of light, in this case a dark on white bar, or if you move it from left to right, it might respond with some spikes or action potentials, similar to what Mayank showed. And that's given in the bottom by these bars that are the spikes of the cell. Now here's an interesting phenomenon called end-stopping that Huber and Wiesel also observed, and that's that if you now extend this bar of light beyond the so-called receptive field of the cell, you get silence, right? So it's almost like the cell is not responding to this longer bar, even though within its receptive field, the area that is originally light, you have the same stimulus, but somehow it's been shut down because now there is this bigger bar. So why is that, right? That's kind of puzzling. I mean, you can come up with explanations such as, well, maybe it's only sensitive to length of the bar, right? That could be one explanation. But here's an intriguing correspondence with what's happening at the retina. So if you go down from the cortex down below LGN and then the retina, you find the circuits there with these retinal ganglion cells responding to what are called center-surround type receptive fields. In this case, if you flash a spot of light, so no longer a bar, it could be just a circular spot of light, in the center of that particular location in the visual field or on the retina, you might get a response shown on the bottom here. But now if you extend that little circle to a bigger circle, there's a fewer number of spikes, or the cell might be completely shut down. The only difference now is that there is, instead of being a bar, which is a more complex type of stimulus, now you have a simple circular stimulus that's causing this kind of a response, right? So this particular phenomenon, one of the interpretations that's been given to it is that if you think of it in terms of redundancy, right? So there's a lot of redundancy in the visual images that are coming in. If you want to do compression, data compression, then what you can do is you can send to the higher part of your brain from the retina only the difference, the error signal, right, between what can be predicted by the circuit that you have and what is coming in. right? So only the errors seem to be what is interesting, right? Sort of the surprise signal or the novelty signal, right? So the retina seems to be responding to novelty or surprise, or if you want to think of it in terms of an engineer, you can think of it as a prediction error signal, right? So what is the prediction here? The prediction is, if you look at any part of the visual space, you can try to predict what's in the center part of a particular location with what is in the surrounding regions. So for example, if you look at this stage or on the computer, on the screen up there, a lot of that is just white space, right? So any location there can be predicted by looking at the surrounding region, and you can predict what's in the center in many of those cases, in most of the cases, by just looking at what is in the surrounding pixels in the image and predict what's in the center. So what you have is this kind of a schematic representation shown on the left here. So if you subtract what's in the surrounding region, the pixel values, from what is in the center region, the center pixel values, you just sum them up and then subtract this center from the surround, you'll get a different signal, and that's all you need to be able to convey what's in that particular location in the visual scene, right? So it's a way of using information theory, if you want to call it that, to actually explain why the retinal cell at the level of retina is behaving in this particular way, right? It's a computational explanation for this kind of a mechanism. It's an explanation that can also be looked at as ecological, right? Because the world that the brain has evolved in is natural. It's not just random pixels. There's some uniformity, there's some regularity in the structure of the world. And so the brain has fine-tuned itself to encode information in as efficient a way as possible. So it's an efficient coding hypothesis that can explain this kind of a coding strategy by the retina. Now, in the case of the visual cortex, you actually get a slightly more complex version of the same kind of phenomenon. So here's some examples that are called contextual modulation. So here's a textured pattern that's uniform texture in this orientation here. You might get a response that looks like this, an extended response, and these are all the individual spike trains that you get. You add them all up, and here's the average response of a particular cell. Now, if you change what is in the center of this square to be the opposite orientation, so if you look closely, you'll see this is the same orientation, but the surrounding context has been flipped, so it's an opposite orientation. You now get a bigger response after a little bit of delay. So this is this bigger response. There's the original response down here. Here's the bigger response. And there's a slight latency to that particular response that happens, after the visual signals travel to several layers or areas of the cortex, so V1, V2, V4, and so on. So this suggests that perhaps this information that's modulating the response of the cell is coming from a higher level abstract area, right? It's basically saying, it's looking at the entire global sort of holistic picture and then coming back down and saying, okay, modify your response because I believe this is like a surprising signal because the center is very different from the surround. So you have now, if you think of it as a prediction error signal, this is basically a bigger error signal because the surrounding context cannot predict what is in the center, right? That's one interpretation you can give it. So this leads us to this model that we suggested back when I was a graduate student and a postdoc. So this is basically a model that says that each cortical area is trying to, it has a model of what is preceding it, and it's trying to make a prediction of what the input to that particular cortical area is, and then it's sending the error signal between its expectation or prediction, and then passing that back to the circuit in the cortical area, and then that keeps going on. So that's basically the loop. So it's a prediction and error correction cycle. And so the underlying hypothesis here is that the brain, or in this case the visual cortex, is constantly trying to predict what it expects to happen based on the statistics of natural scenes, for example, in the case of the visual system. And that's, and basically the learning that goes on is a way of minimizing this error signal, right? So if you get a big error signal, it means that you have a bad model of the world in your brain, and so then you correct it by changing what are called synapses. So these are basically the connections between the cells. And you have, in this case, as you can see, feed forward and feed back synapses. So these are carrying information forward. These are carrying information backward to the lower area. And the error signal is what is driving the learning process and also the instantaneous correction. For example, if you're looking at a moving scene with an animal that's moving across, you're constantly trying to predict its position, for example, then you can correct your prediction of position if the animal suddenly accelerates. You can then correct it based on the difference in your prediction and what actually came in through your eyes. And so that's the way that this particular feedback loop works. And so for engineers, it's a pretty comfortable kind of model because engineers have been doing this for a very long time in terms of feedback loops, servo loops, and so on, right? So the bottom line here is that this is basically a Bayesian model, right? So what do we mean by a Bayesian model? So I'll just give you a really quick overview of that. So Bayesian comes from a person, right? Thomas Bayes, who was actually a nonconformist reverend, right? He was a minister. And his first publication, so we all like to list our publications, right? So here's the first publication of Thomas Bayes. So it was this title, right? So Divine Benevolence. Or basically it's an attempt to prove that God is kind, right? So this was his first mathematical proof that, you know, there is a kindness, or sort of the happiness of all of us is the ultimate goal of God, right? And somewhat surprisingly, his last publication was actually on what is called Bayes' theorem, right? It's a completely mathematical theorem that essentially gives us a way to incorporate evidence as it comes in and combine that with prior knowledge that we have, or any agent might have, or any robot might have, or any animal might have, right? So here's what, oh, by the way, I dulled that image because there's some controversy on whether that picture is Bayes or not, right? So there's uncertainty even in terms of who that person is. So don't quote me on that particular image of being a Bayes. So here's Bayes' theorem, put really simply, right? So at any point in time, you might have some prior belief, and you can quantify that as a probability distribution over some x, which is, you know, a random variable. And then at any point in time, you might get some evidence or some information coming in if you measure using a camera or your eyes. You might have some input. I could be an input, information coming in. Now the big problem for if you're designing an artificial system, or if you think of it as an animal's problem, is how do you combine this new information coming from the retina or from the ears or skin and so on with this prior belief I might have about the world, right? Some belief about, in this case, the probability distribution. And so that's where Bayes' theorem comes in. It gives you a way of revising your belief, right? So you come up with a posterior probability distribution that gives you a way of computing a new belief, which is x, given that I've seen this new information I. And this is just a mathematical definition of conditional probability, right? So if you're familiar with probability theory, this is just using joint probability definition and then inverting this by having this particular expression, right? So nothing too profound about it, but surprisingly quite powerful in the sense that it gives us a way of combining information coming in from our sensors with some prior belief you might have, and then normalizing it with this P of I down below is just a normalization factor to make all the probabilities sum to 1, right? And so that's the bottom line of Bayes' theorem. And just to motivate it, how does this apply to perception, right? So how many of you know who this is? Raise your hand. Oh, okay. Don't say it though. But as I give you more evidence or more input information, right, you're going to be changing your belief as to who this person is, right? So I'm giving you more and more evidence now. And now it's pretty clear probably, right, with the nose and the hands, and the mustache is a dead giveaway, right? So now your posterior probability distribution is probably all highly peaked at Einstein, right? And in this case, unless you don't know who Einstein is, I think you're all on the same page, right, at this point. There are lots of interesting phenomena that people had, very specialized models, computational or mathematical models, but really the Bayesian framework gives you a very unifying way of looking at those. So simple examples, visual illusions. So you might have heard of the barber pole illusion, or the waterfall illusion, or the illusion where the bicycle spokes seem to be going the wrong direction. All of these can be explained through Bayesian models because they all it gives you a way of explaining what kinds of assumptions the brain has evolved to make in order to make sense of the natural world. So in order to make sense of the natural world, the inputs are very ambiguous. So how do you actually make sense of it? Well, the brain has come up with some assumptions that it uses, simplifying assumptions that gives it, most of the time it works really well, but for some kinds of images, it'll give you these illusions, right? And so there are some chapters in these books that talk about visual illusions also. And here's a picture to have in mind, right? So it's hard to see what's shown there. There's actually here's some mountains and so on, and then over here is the person and the brain is supposed to be the estimator, right? So here's the internal reality of the person, and they have an internal model of the world, and there's some parameters that they might be estimating depending on, if you're what kind of an animal you are, you might have different kinds of hardware inside your brain that's estimating those parameters. And so the hidden state of the world is something that you're trying to estimate, the physical reality over here, and this is the neural reality, right? So this is something, as Mike mentioned, there's the dynamics here. Here's where you're really trying to maintain estimates of what's out there, and you're doing this because you want to survive, you want to maximize your potential for survival if you're doing it in an evolutionary sort of way. And so the fundamental idea is that the inputs received are caused by some external states of the world, and these are the so-called hidden causes. And the goal of this animal or this robotic system is to estimate the probability of those causes, the inputs received so far, right? And here's just a simple example of how you can mathematically define it, right? So suppose you give an image, once again an Einstein image, I can decompose it in terms of these edge filters, like the ones that we showed the video of. And I can also synthesize an image by combining these edges in a particular way, right? So you can do both an analysis by filtering, so you can just take it, figure out which of these filters most resembles that location in the image, and that's given by the right-hand side, these vertical bars, or how strongly vertical or horizontal those edges are. And then you can combine those same filters, the same representation, linearly with a weighted sum, and you can generate an image now, right? So now you can see how you can do both a prediction or a generation of an image as well as an analysis of the image, right? So this gives rise to this idea that we originally saw, this predictive coding model, right? So the feed-forward part is where you're doing the analysis of the image, and the feedback is where you're doing the synthesis, right? So this relates to this idea of, the imagination, right? So this is sort of a very primitive way of imagination being generated in terms of you're generating images in this case, or lower level representations of the cortical areas if you're a higher level cortical area. And this is just for the mathematics lovers, right? There's something called a Kalman filter that implements exactly this, and I won't go into detail. If you're interested, you can look at the papers. And interestingly, this gives you a way of modeling things like attention also. So you can filter what's coming in through in terms of the prediction error can be filtered, and so depending on what you're paying attention to in the image, for example, you can model that using this kind of a framework where the errors are filtered according to where you're paying attention and so on. And you can extend this, like I said, to multi-layered networks. So initially you have images, and then you have the first level of prediction. Those can be converging to get more and more complex or abstract representation. You can have a hierarchical network, and it's related to something called deep learning for those who might have heard the term in machine learning or in AI, artificial intelligence. And basically it's a network that feeds in on itself and takes the inputs from the preceding layer and then processes it and goes on to the next layer and so on. And as you're doing that, you can learn more complex kinds of representations, such as edges become elongated edges, corners might become surfaces, and then objects and so on. And that's just a way of modeling the different input and output pathways with the 6-layered structure of the cortex. So just to leave you with the kinds of things you can do with this kind of model. Suppose you train this network on a bunch of natural images of scenes containing animals and trees and natural streams and mountains and so on. Then you can say, okay, what does this computer simulation predict in terms of the responses, right? So you can show that this computer network will learn these edge detectors. Those seem to be the primitives for ecologically representing natural images. And then secondly, you can show if you have 2 layers in the network, then the second layer has more information of the surrounding context, so it can predict what's in the center in the lower layer. And so you get this phenomenon of end stopping that I showed before. So you can see that if you look at the top one for this little bar, you have a big error signal, but then when you have a longer bar, the surrounding context lets you predict what's in the center, so the errors are reduced now. And to motivate this from a natural image perspective, if you look at natural images, these tiny regions of natural images tend to have continuation of orientation, right? So any sort of random patch you pick, there's a very high probability that there is some statistics that is very similar across the local pixels here, and that's what's giving you this particular phenomenon, right? So the brain has very cleverly encoded, if you believe in this model, has very cleverly encoded the statistics of natural images as such that it can reduce the redundancy as it sends the information over to the next level. It doesn't have to send the whole image or the whole picture. It can send only the differences, the prediction errors, from one level to the next level. And we did some comparisons to neural data and so on. That's in the Nature Neuroscience paper there. And finally, just to conclude this part, I think I have another 15 minutes for the last part, right? I'll just conclude this with this interesting experiment in fMRI, brain imaging, so no longer neurons, and this is in humans. So what Moray et al. Did was they showed a person or a bunch of people 3 different types of images that are shown at the very top. So the random images are exactly the same set of lines, but configured in 3 different ways. So random would mean these lines are randomly placed in an image, and then 2D would be you construct a nice 2-dimensional shape, and 3D would be where they're now constructing a shape with the same lines, but looks like a 3-dimensional image to a human, right? So the question is, what would you predict if you're looking at, let's say, the first visual area in your brain, the second cortical visual area in the brain, right? So if you look at the first cortical visual area in the brain, would you predict that it will respond to the first, second, or third? probably this is the first cortical area, it's the lowermost cortical area, right? And we already know it responds to lines and so on, right? So you might predict that it will respond the most to the first one. And similarly, if you go higher up, you know it encodes more abstract objects and so on. So potentially you think, well, it will respond to the three-dimensional shapes, perhaps, right? And that's what they did find. They found that if you look at this lower graph over here, they found that this LOC is the higher area, and then this V1 is the lower area. They found that random lines, the higher area responds, the most to the three-dimensional shapes, and the lower area responds the most to the random lines. But interestingly, as predicted by this prediction error model, there's a suppression, right? There's a suppression of the response in the case of the random lines. But more interestingly, look at this one here, right? So here, for the three-dimensional case, right, there's a big response in the higher area, but very low response in the lower area. So it's basically the lower area has been, in some sense, suppressed, saying that, hey, the higher area is now saying, I can take care of this image, right? I know exactly what that is. It's a three-dimensional object, and so you no longer have to respond to those lines there because I know what that is. Because at the higher level, the prediction is very accurate and can predict away the signal that is there at the lower level. Whereas if it's just a random jumble of lines, then the higher area can make sense of it. So the prediction there is presumably not going to explain what is there at the lower level. So the lower level of the cortex has to take care of that and give the interpretation that the higher level cannot really interpret, right? So it's an interesting way of interpreting this particular data. All right, and so I guess I didn't have the word consciousness in my talk, but I thought I'll put this in there just to pay tribute to the really profound conversations we've been having. And in fact, there's a couple of books that have come out that explore this notion of how do we go from, this prediction error model, the prediction error minimization model, how do we go from there to really, bigger notions of consciousness and so what relates those two concepts, awareness and consciousness and cognition, is this idea of an internal model, right? So the Bayesian framework is one mathematically sound framework. There could be other frameworks also. But basically it's this idea that the brain builds a model, an internal model of the world, the physical world, as well as itself and as well as other agents, right? Other people and so on. And that's basically what we use to interpret the information coming in. So the prediction concept is quite versatile in that sense that it lets you learn an internal model, minimize errors and learn internal models and then pursue actions and model other people and so on. So there's books that have explored those concepts. Okay, so in the remaining time that I have, I will just give you some brief examples of a different way of looking at this notion of perception and cognition and motor control, right? And so this is through this whole area called brain-computer interfaces. And this is a way of understanding and also enhancing cognition, if you want to call it that, right? So can the brain go beyond just controlling the evolutionarily endowed body that we have, the biological body? Can it start controlling other devices that are out there in the external world? And eventually, can we also do something like a computer-assisted telepathy, right? Can we communicate with another person directly by connecting their brains together, right? So it's quite a science fiction type idea, but we did do a very, very simple experiment that touched at that topic, right? So here's the picture to have in mind for this brain-computer interfacing. You're recording from the brain, you're processing it using machine learning or some computer science techniques, and then you're trying to control applications. So for a person who's paralyzed, you might be controlling a wheelchair, or a person who cannot even speak, you might be controlling a cursor on a computer screen, or you might be controlling a prosthetic hand, right? If you're an amputee, for example, you can use the brain signal to control an artificial or robotic hand, and then you can give feedback by stimulating the brain. So you can stimulate the brain to send information back into the brain. And here are some ways in which we've explored collecting information from the brain. So starting from very invasive methods to the non-invasive methods. So Mayank already talked about using electrodes to record from individual brain cells or neurons. We look at this technique called ECOG, or brain surface recording. So it's a semi-invasive method in the sense that you still have to go below the skull, but you're not going inside the brain, right? And how are we doing this? We're doing this in patients who are coming in for surgery, brain surgery in the hospital, right? They're coming in for epilepsy surgery. I think Mayank mentioned that in one of his slides. And so we're doing this with patients who are there in the hospital for 7 to 10 days, and they already have these electrodes or wires on the surface of their brain because they're being monitored for seizures. and then these wires are taken out, and then they go in for the surgery to take out the part of the brain that is causing the seizures, right? The focus of the seizures. So that's the purpose in which they're in the hospital for. So during those 7 to 10 days, we go in, and this is one of my students, Kai Miller. We go in and ask them, are they willing to participate in scientific experiments? Because that's an opportunity that we have here, right? So many of them, they'd rather do that than just sit and watch TV or talk to some of their relatives, right? Sometimes they get bored of that too. So in this particular case, we do the kinds of experiments where we first of all ask them to do simple experiments like move their hand, so pump their hand open, basically open and shut. And so what you get is these kinds of signals, very noisy signals, but there are some changes that you can detect, even visually in this case, right? So if they're resting, you get some oscillation, some particular oscillation of the brain signal from the area of the brain that is causing hand movement. But once they start moving their hand, you get a suppression in the oscillations at a particular frequency, right? So the low frequency fluctuations go away. When you actually make an intentional movement, the low frequency fluctuation goes away. So the brain is no longer in this kind of rest mode where it's oscillating. And then there's an increase also in the high frequency fluctuations. And that's a pretty universal phenomenon we see in any kind of intentional tasks. So it could be visual attention, it could be visual memory, and so on. In different locations of the brain or the cortex, you start to see this kind of a phenomenon. And the other thing you can see is the high frequency information, the high frequency fluctuation, the high frequency oscillations is very localized compared to the low frequency one. And what that means is that I can then look at particular locations of your brain and I can extract information from it, and then I can start using it for potentially controlling devices, right? So for example, if I have a way of recording from the hand area that controls your hand, right, then you can generate that information from your brain and I can use it to control a prosthetic hand, for example, right? So one of the interesting thing is, again speaks to this idea of imagery, right, or imagination, right? So if you look at the hand movement area, you get a pretty robust signal after moving your hand. But suppose you ask the patient to stop moving stop moving and just imagine, moving their hand, right? So imagine in this case, generate the intention to move the hand, but don't move your hand. You get a similar activation, except it's now not as strong, right? It might be about 60% of the activation you get if they're actually moving their hand, right? So that's the imagery signal. But here's the interesting fact, right? One is if you now couple this weak imagery signal with a cursor, so every time you imagine moving your hand, I'm going to make the cursor go up, let's say, and when you're relaxing, I'm going to make the cursor go down, you can solve this task of trying to hit the target, right? So on the right-hand side is the ECOG signal. When it gets red is when the cursor goes up. If it's blue, the cursor is going to go down right in the center of that activation patch over there. And so the subject can decide whether to relax or to intentionally generate this imagery of moving their hand, depending on whether the target is at the bottom or at the top, right? So very simple one-dimensional cursor control task, if you want to call it that. And we've done this also for two-dimensional movement and so on. But the one-dimensional one is very robust. So the patients can do this within a few minutes. They can learn to generate and then control this cursor and hit the target in a few minutes time. More interestingly is what is happening in the brain when they're learning this very unusual task, right? Because their brain has never controlled a cursor before directly, right? I mean, they might have controlled using their hand, a mouse, but here you're saying activate this location in your brain, I'm going to make the cursor go up. So what you see is that they're able to selectively activate that location that is controlling the cursor. So we're only taking information from one location, and that location is becoming more and more active, and as they're getting more and more accurate, from 48% accuracy all the way to 94% accuracy, they're able to generate by really focusing and activating a particular location in their brain. So this just shows that, one other interesting thing is if you compare the activation for that particular location to the activation for physically moving the hand, this is actually larger by about 30%, right? So the brain is able to almost liberate itself, you might say, from the kind of activation it needs to move its hand. Now it's actually exceeding that amount of activation to control this artificial cursor, right? So it just testifies to the flexibility that the brain has in trying to reconfigure its circuits to control a device if you're giving adequate feedback. Okay, and I'll conclude in the last, 6 minutes I have with this way of recording from the brain. This is basically recording non-invasively from the scalp. And so what you can do with this is you can do things like recognize when somebody is focusing their attention on a particular object, let's say the medicine bottle, and I flash the medicine bottle, the background of that particular medicine bottle image. And when you flash something that you're focusing your attention on, you get a mental aha signal, right? It's like a surprise signal. And so this is something where if you're looking around and trying to find the nearest building, and then you're looking around, you all of a sudden use a sign, then you get this aha signal, right? Because the visual system has recognized something, so you have that recognition response, and we can recognize that using this EEG or scalp recordings. And so on the right-hand side, you can see when there's a flash. So right now, I think it's on a cycle. So if you wait a little bit, you can see on the top part, the target flash is going to be on the green. So right now, there's a flash. 300 milliseconds later, you'll see a visual response to the back. Now it's blue, and then the red has gone to the top of the frontal part of the brain, right? So there's a visual response followed by a cognitive response, and that's something that's called a visually evoked potential, or a P300 signal. And you don't get that response when the flash is happening at a different location that you're not focusing your attention on. And so we can use this property to then build an interface that can guide a humanoid robot to pick up an object and bring it to a particular location. So here's an example of that, right? So this humanoid robot is walking along. It's completely autonomous up to a point, but then at some point it sees objects in its visual field, and when it sees objects, it beams back that information to the person. The person can then pick one of those objects up by just looking at and paying attention, and we're using this P300 signal in the EEG, and the robot then does the job of picking it up. This is all robotics, right? And once it's picked up the object, then the person gets to decide where to bring that object to. So once again, two different tables on the top and bottom part, and the robot can turn and walk and then drop off this particular object that you selected to this particular location that you selected, right? So basically this was done back in 2007, 2008, and so just a very simple example where you can start to extract signals from the brain non-invasively and control what some people have called like a robotic avatar, right? So basically you're conveying intention signals to this remote object, to this remote robotic avatar, and then that's taking care of a lot of the low-level control dynamics and so on, but then it's using your intention to enact your desire in a different location. And I'll skip this one. This is another kind of, you can navigate and use imagery to navigate, and then you can pick up objects in this particular virtual world. And again, we're using, in this case, foot imagery to move forward, left-hand imagery to move left, and then right-hand imagery to move right, and so on. So once again, these are the kinds of signals you can train yourself to generate, similar to the ECOG example. And then in this case, it's a three-dimensional control example where you're moving around in this virtual world, picking up these coins that are left in the on the floor. So this is a book that John had mentioned that gives an overview of a lot of the advances in this area called brain-machine interfaces or brain-computer interfaces. And most of these are designed for assistive devices for people who are disabled. And so you might say, okay, we saw examples where the EEG signal was being used to control a robot or to move around and control a computer in a computer world. So the last question that I'll leave you with is this one, right? So can you actually convey the intention now to a person instead of an artificial object like a computer or to a robot, right? And this is something that several other people are interested in, including Miguel Nicolelis, who will speak, I believe, in the evening. And so what we were thinking of was, well, if you really want to demonstrate this, we have the tools to do the first part, which is record and decode the intention of a person, the imagery signal, right? So I can decode if I want to move my hand or not. I can decode that. But how do you then convey that information to another person's brain, right? So you need some way of writing the brain, right? So you want to do it non-invasively also. So here's one technology. It uses magnetic fields to cause excitation in the brain. Basically, it's Faraday's law, right? So you have electric currents that get translated into an induced magnetic field that penetrates the skull, and then you have an induced electric field, or electric current, that excites some brain cells in the location in which you put this coil. So it's a figure-of-8 coil that focuses the electrical stimulation. And so we use this to do a very simple kind of experiment, right? So in the very first experiment back in 2013, I was one of the guinea pigs, and my collaborator Andrea Soko was the other guinea pig, and we tried this where we essentially recorded my EEG, and that was used to control Andrea's hand, right? So I was imagining moving my hand, and if the computer decoded that, it would then send an electrical signal to his brain to move his hand. And we're doing this in the context of a game. So in this case, The sender's brain, that's my brain, I can see what's happening in this computer screen, but my hands are tied, right? Not literally, but I couldn't move my hand. But his hand was free to hit the keyboard, but he could not see, right? He could not see what was happening on my screen. So this was an example of a collaboration between two brains, where the collaboration was happening directly by connecting my motor cortex that was generating the signal to his motor cortex that was moving his hand, so that we closed the loop for finishing this task that we had, right? So a simple proof of concept demonstration that you can couple two brains together, right? So this is, on the left is the scene happening in the computer science building. On the right-hand side is in the psychology building where he's waiting to receive information. Every time his hand twitches, it means that he got a magnetic stimulation in the motor region of his brain. His hand twitches and it causes that particular rocket to explode, right? Because that was the game that we were playing, was to destroy these pirate rockets that were trying to threaten a city, right? So this was a proof of concept, and you can read the full report on 6 different subjects in a paper in 2014. And more recently, we did this more interactive version of a brain-to-brain communication. So in this case, what you're doing is you're playing a 20 questions game. In this case, it was actually only 3 questions, but the idea is similar. So one person thinks of an object, let's say a dog, and then the other person, the inquirer, asks questions. Does it fly? Does it a pet? And does it have a tail? And so on. And the first person has to reply yes or no answers. And they're conveying the yes or no answers not by speaking, but by their brain signals, right? So they're basically conveying the yes or no answer by looking at 2 different flashing LED lights. And depending on the frequency of the flashing LED light, I can tell whether you're saying yes or whether you're saying no. Because I'm looking at the visual cortex, it's oscillating at a particular frequency, and I can decode that using the computer and then convey that to my partner, and the partner gets a stimulation again in the visual cortex. And so when you stimulate the visual cortex with a magnetic field, you see a flash of light. And the flash of light means that the answer is yes from that person, right? So very simple binary way of communicating information of the yes or no answers. And this is the last slide. So this just shows that you can really communicate information between one brain to the other using even this very primitive kind of technology. On average, 5 different pairs of humans conveyed the correct answer, or they were able to figure out the correct answer 72% of the time. And in the ROC curve shown for the pair as well as individual participants, you can see that some of them got really good. So some of them actually were able to achieve pretty close to a true positive rate of 1, right? And a false positive rate close to 0. So some of them were able to learn to interpret the signals that they were getting in their brain as a flash of light or not a flash of light, and then they were able to use that information to figure out the answer, okay? So anyway, if you're interested, you can look at, this is a paper also was published in PLOS One early on last year. All right, so I think I'll conclude with that, and I'm happy to take questions at the panel later, or maybe in the break that we have right now. And I'm almost on time, so thank you for your attention.
We break now. That's for 30 minutes, and I request all of you to please assemble by 5 minutes past 4.